Olamide's children, now grown, had become part of the fabric of the village. They were men and women of strength, both in body and in spirit. Among them was Adekunle, the son born of Chief Adeyemi's wife and Olamide, who faced the most conflict. Adekunle was a man of impossible beauty, more so than Olamide had ever been. His dark skin, smooth like the polished wood of the Iroko tree, shone with a natural luster. His body, sculpted by years of physical labor, was the envy of every man. His hair, thick and coiled, framed his handsome face, and his eyes, a piercing black, could captivate any woman's gaze. He had inherited Olamide's charm, and like his father before him, he carried a physical endowment that made women in the village blush and giggle whenever he passed. Yet not all was well for Adekunle. Despite his influence, he was constantly reminded that he was the son of a former slave, and his ambitions to end the slave trade in the village were met with resistance. The men who profited from the trade, powerful men who now filled the shoes of their fathers, did not want to lose their grip on the wealth it brought. Among them was Kehinde, Chief Adeyemi's biological son, who had inherited the title of chief after his father passed. Kehinde, Chief Adeyemi's true son, had spent years building his kingdom within the village, not just with the riches from the slave trade, but through careful political maneuvering. Unlike the physical power of Adekunle, Kehinde's strength lay in his influence over the village congress, a body of elders, merchants, and influential families who made decisions on behalf of the village. The congress was supposed to be a fair and just system, where votes decided important matters like trade, law, and leadership. But Kehinde had made sure that the majority of the congress was in his pocket, through bribes, favors, and whispered promises in the dark. Many in the congress were indebted to him, particularly the wealthiest men who profited from the slave trade. Among Kehinde's closest allies were Elder Sola, the most senior member of the Congress, whose greed knew no bounds, and Madame Ronke, a powerful widow who controlled much of the village's agricultural wealth. Madame Ronke's influence was not to be underestimated. Many feared her sharp tongue and even sharper mind. She had an iron grip on several of the village's women who looked to her for guidance. Kehinde ruled not with brute force, but with subtle manipulation, knowing exactly how to twist the minds of those around him. The village was not governed by swords. It was governed by whispered deals, promises made in the back rooms of huts, and the clinking of coins. Adekunle, on the other hand, was an outsider to this world of quiet corruption. Though he had the love of the people, that was not enough. He needed real power if he was to make any significant changes. The slave trade was too deeply entrenched, too profitable for Kehinde and his allies. Adekunle knew that he would need to play a different game if he was to bring about change. He would need to use the same political system that Kehinde controlled against him. But it wouldn't be easy. Kehinde had built an empire that was well protected by his web of alliances. And so Adekunle devised a plan that would take time, patience, and strategy. He would start where his father had once thrived, among the women. Adekunle knew that his path to victory lay not just in brute force, but in the subtle art of persuasion. He understood that the men of the Congress were influenced by more than just money. They were influenced by the whispers of the women in their lives. And no woman held more sway in the village than Madame Ronke, a powerful widow who had Kehinde's ear. Madame Ronke was no ordinary woman. She had built her influence over the years, not just through wealth, but through her sharp intellect and ruthless ambition. Adekunle had heard the stories of her cunning, how she could make or break a man's career with a single word. He knew that if he could win her over, half the battle would be won. For weeks, Adekunle attended the gatherings Madame Ronke hosted, quiet dinners where the village's elite women discussed their futures and the fates of their families. He was careful not to push too hard, listening attentively, observing and biding his time. Madame Ronke, however, seemed impervious to his charm. She had heard the rumors of Adekunle's beauty, his seductive prowess, but she was not one to fall so easily. One evening, as the conversation at the dinner table turned to politics, Adekunle made his move. "Madam Ronke," he began, his voice smooth and respectful. "I've always admired your influence in the village. Surely you see how much power you hold, even more than some of the men in the Congress." Madam Ronke raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "Flattery will get you nowhere with me, Adekunle. I am loyal to Kehinde, as you well know." Adekunle smiled, leaning in just slightly. "I do not doubt your loyalty, Madam Ronke, but I believe you deserve more. What if you were not just an ally to Kehinde, but the one who truly called the shots? Together, we could make decisions that benefit the village in ways Kehinde never could." Madam Ronke studied Adekunle, her eyes narrowing slightly. She was intrigued by his boldness, but not convinced. "You speak with ambition, Adekunle, but ambition alone is not enough. Kehinde controls the Congress, and no amount of sweet words from you will change that." Adekunle, sensing her resistance, softened his approach. "Madam Ronke, I don't come here to just talk. I come here to offer you something real, something that can change the future for both of us." Madam Ronke's eyes flickered with interest, but she kept her expression neutral. "You think, say, I never hear this kind thing before?" She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "If you truly want to help me, Adekunle, then show me you're not all words. I have a problem that needs solving. Clear the overgrown bushes in my backyard. Help me with that, and maybe, just maybe, I'll consider discussing Congress matters with you." Adekunle blinked in surprise, but he smiled. "If that is what it takes, I'll do it." The next morning, Adekunle arrived at Madam Ronke's home, dressed in nothing but a pair of shorts, ready to clear the overgrown bushes in her backyard. As he worked, sweat glistening on his chest, his muscles flexing with every movement, Madam Ronke watched from her window. She had initially intended the task as a test, a way to dismiss Adekunle's advances. But as she saw him toiling in the sun, shirtless, his body sculpted and powerful, something shifted inside her. Her eyes drifted lower, lingering on the bulge in Adekunle's shorts. His presence was overwhelming, his strength, his beauty, his confidence. She could feel a heat rising in her, an urge she hadn't felt in years. When Adekunle finished his work, she invited him inside for dinner, her voice calm, but her mind already racing. That evening, over a simple meal, the atmosphere between them had shifted. Adekunle remained respectful, but there was something in his gaze, something in the way he listened to her that made Madam Ronke feel seen in a way she hadn't before. "You worked hard today," Madam Ronke said, her voice softer than usual, her eyes lingering on his chest. "I appreciate that." "I told you I'm serious about helping," Adekunle replied, his voice deep and smooth as his eyes met hers. "And I'm willing to do more if it means we can work together." Madam Ronke's heart began to race. She stood, gesturing toward the back of her home. "Come with me. I want to show you something." Adekunle followed her through the dimly lit halls, his eyes catching the subtle sway of her hips as she led him toward her room. When they arrived at the doorway, Madam Ronke hesitated, her hand resting on the doorframe. "This is where I spend most of my time," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's private." Adekunle stepped closer, his breath warm on her neck as he whispered, "I'd like to see the size of it. I'm sure it's as impressive as the rest of your home." Madam Ronke swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She opened the door and stepped inside, her heart pounding as she felt Adekunle's presence close behind her. When she turned to face him, she saw him pulling off his shirt, revealing his broad, chiseled chest. Her eyes widened, and she felt an undeniable heat pooling deep within her. "Adekunle," she whispered, but before she could finish, he stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. The tension between them was electric. "I know what you really want, Ronka," Adekunle murmured, his voice low and filled with desire. "And I can give it to you. I'll make you my woman. I'll give you everything you deserve." Madame Ronka could no longer resist. The desire that had been building inside her finally erupted, and she rushed forward, pressing her lips to his in a passionate, desperate kiss. Adekunle responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her against his body as their lips moved in a heated frenzy. Without a word, he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the bed, where he laid her down gently. His hands moved slowly, caressing every inch of her body as she gasped with anticipation. Adekunle knew exactly how to please a woman, and he took his time, moving with precision and care. He kissed her neck, her collarbone, and lower still, as Madame Ronka moaned softly beneath him. His hands roamed her body, teasing, tantalizing, until she was trembling with need. "Please, Adekunle," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't wait any longer." Adekunle smiled, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "I'll give you everything, Ronka, and when we're done, you'll never want anyone else." With that, he entered her slowly, savoring the moment, and she gasped, her back arching as pleasure coursed through her body. Adekunle moved with a rhythm that built steadily, faster and deeper with each thrust, his hands gripping her hips as he brought her closer and closer to the edge. Madame Ronka's moans filled the room as she surrendered completely to him, her body quivering with each wave of pleasure. Adekunle was relentless, his movements skilled and controlled, and he knew exactly how to drive her wild. By the time they finished, Madame Ronka lay breathless, her body trembling from the aftershocks of pleasure. She looked up at Adekunle, her eyes filled with desire and admiration. "I'll make you my woman, Ronke," Adekunle whispered, his lips brushing against hers. "I'll give you everything Kehinde can't. Power, control, even children, if that's what you want." Madame Ronke's heart raced, her mind spinning. She had never been seduced like this, never felt so desired, so wanted. And in that moment, she knew she would give Adekunle whatever he asked. "When the Congress meets again," Adekunle murmured, his voice low and soothing, "we'll make our decision together, you and I, partners in everything." Madame Ronka nodded, her body still tingling from their encounter. "I promise," she whispered, "we'll make the decision together." Adekunle smiled, a spark of victory flashing in his eyes. He had won. Madame Ronke was now firmly on his side, and with her influence, the Congress would soon follow. Adekunle had heard the rumors circulating through the village, whispers that Elder Dorojayi, one of Kehinde's most trusted allies, was completely under the control of his much younger wife, Aminat. The elder, wealthy but old, doted on his wife, and it was said that she could bend him to her will with just a glance. But there were darker whispers as well. Rumors that Aminat, despite her wealth and status, was deeply unhappy in her marriage. Adekunle knew this was an opportunity, but the approach had to be careful and natural. He learned that Aminat often went to the stream to fetch water at a particular time every day. So one afternoon, Adekunle made his way to the stream, planning to appear as if by coincidence. Stripping down to just his shorts, he waded into the cool water for a swim, his body glistening in the sun as his muscles moved powerfully beneath his skin. It wasn't long before Aminat appeared, carrying her pot to the stream. As she approached the water's edge, her eyes landed on Adekunle and she froze. The sight of him, his broad shoulders, his defined chest, and the unmistakable bulge in his shorts made her heart race. She had never seen a man so physically striking, so powerful. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched him move through the water, unaware that she was staring. Adekunle, noticing her gaze, decided to play coy. Emerging from the water, he casually grabbed his towel acting as though he hadn't seen her. But when he turned to face her, he smirked, his eyes locking onto hers. "You dey look me like that with lust, Aminat," he teased, his voice smooth and teasing. "Abi you no be Elder Durojaye's wife. Wetting your husband go think if he see you like this?" Aminat's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. "No be like that, Adekunle," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "You no go understand. My husband, he no be good man." Adekunle's smirk faded as he took a step closer, his expression softening. "Wetin you mean? You dey married to the most powerful man in the village. Why you talk like that?" Aminat's eyes filled with tears as the truth she had kept hidden for so long came rushing to the surface. "He no dey treat me well. He old, wicked, and I dey suffer in silence. I never get satisfaction from him, Adekunle. Sometimes I dey wish I fit be free." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke, and before she could turn away, Adekunle stepped closer, his heart stirring at the sight of her pain. Gently, he reached out, his thumb brushing away her tears. "You no suppose cry like this, Aminat," he whispered, his voice low and filled with empathy. "You deserve more. A woman like you deserve happiness." Aminat looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. The warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his voice, it was overwhelming. She felt a pull toward him, an attraction so intense it scared her, yet she couldn't resist. Adekunle leaned in slowly, his lips brushing hers in a soft, lingering kiss. At first, Aminat hesitated, but the moment his lips touched hers, she was lost. The kiss deepened, filled with an urgency that neither of them could deny. Adekunle's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer as their bodies pressed together by the water's edge. Aminat gasped, her fingers clutching at his chest, her breath quickening as she felt the heat rising between them. Without breaking the kiss, Adekunle laid her down on the soft grass by the stream, his hands sliding down her body, exploring every curve. Aminat moaned softly, her body trembling with desire she hadn't felt in years. As his lips moved to her neck, her chest, and lower, she arched her back, overwhelmed by the pleasure coursing through her veins. "Adekunle," she whispered, her voice breathless, "I no fit remember the last time I feel like this." Adekunle smiled against her skin, his hands gentle but firm as he slowly undressed her. "I go give you everything you dey miss," he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "Make you no fear. I go take care of you." With a soft moan, Aminat surrendered completely to him, her body quivering with anticipation. Adekunle entered her slowly, savoring the moment as she gasped beneath him. He moved with a deliberate rhythm, teasing her with every slow, deep thrust, watching as her body responded to his every touch. Aminat's moans filled the air, her fingers digging into the earth beneath her as Adekunle's pace quickened, their passion building with each movement. He took his time, knowing exactly how to bring her to the edge, how to make her beg for more. Aminat's body trembled with pleasure, her breaths coming in short, desperate gasps as she lost herself in the intensity of the moment. Adekunle's hands gripped her hips, his thrusts becoming faster, harder, until they both cried out in unison, their bodies shuddering together as they reached the peak of their passion. As they lay by the stream, their bodies entwined, Aminat's mind swelled with emotions she hadn't felt in years. She had never known such pleasure, such fulfillment. It was more than just the physical. It was the way Adekunle had made her feel seen, desired, and understood. "Adekunle," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I no go forget this moment. Anything you want from me, I go give to you. Wealth, power, anything. Just name it." Adekunle smiled, running a hand gently through her hair as he leaned down to kiss her softly. "I know they ask for wealth, Aminat," he murmured, his lips brushing against hers. "I dey try make change for this village. I believe say you fit play a big role in this journey. Aminat looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with admiration. "Anything you need, Adekunle. I go help you. Just tell me wetin you want." "When the Congress meet again," Adekunle said, his voice soft but firm, "I need your husband to vote against Kehinde. We go make this village better, but I no fit do and without your support." Aminat nodded, her heart racing. "I go make sure he do as you say. Anything you want, I go make sure he follow your lead." Adekunle smiled, satisfied. He had won her over, not just with his charm, but with the promise of something more: freedom, power, and the chance to be part of something greater. Aminat was now firmly on his side, and with her influence over her husband, Adekunle knew that the next Congress meeting would bring him one step closer to victory. While Adekunle's influence over the women of the village grew, Kehinde was not blind to his half-brother's maneuvers. He had spies carefully monitoring every move Adekunle made, feeding back whispers and details of his growing alliances. Kehinde's anger simmered as he learned of Adekunle's closeness with Madame Ronke and Aminat. His control over the Congress was slipping, and his frustration was beginning to boil over. During a late-night meeting with his closest allies, Elder Sola voiced what Kehinde had been dreading. "Kehinde, you fit still stop am," Elder Sola said, his voice low. "Adekunle they gather too much support from the women. You need to act now before the next vote." Kehinde's face hardened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. "I know that fool they try outsmart me," Kehinde snarled, "but I no go let 'em win." Just as they were speaking, the door to the room creaked open, and Madame Ronke entered, her face unreadable. Kehinde's expression shifted as he saw her, his annoyance briefly hidden behind a smile. "Ronke," Kehinde began, his voice more measured, "what brings you here so late?" Madame Ronke moved gracefully into the room, her eyes scanning the faces of Kehinde's allies before settling on him. "I came to speak with you, Kehinde. There is something you need to know, and I wanted you to hear it from me first." Kehinde raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to continue. Madame Ronke took a breath, her voice steady, but tinged with the weight of her decision. "I will be marrying Adekunle," she said simply, her eyes searching Kehinde's face for a reaction. "I believe in his vision for this village. The slave trade. It's time to end it. We have enough fertile land and resources to export. We can still thrive without the trade." For a moment, there was silence. Then Kehinde began to laugh, a deep, mocking laugh that filled the room. His eyes sparkled with amusement as he leaned back in his chair. "He got to you, didn't he?" Kehinde said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Adekunle, he's just like his father, Olamide. That slave knew how to charm women and make them feel special, but all he cared about was pleasure and power." Madame Ronke's face remained impassive, though her eyes flickered with doubt. "This isn't about his father, Kehinde. This is about the future of the village. We can export resources instead of people. We can grow stronger by working the land. You know this trade is unsustainable." Kehinde's laughter died down, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Ronke," he said quietly, "Adekunle doesn't love you. He's using you, just like he's used every other woman who crosses his path. You think he sees you as a partner? No, he sees you as a tool." Madame Ronke's face hardened. "You don't know him like I do." Kehinde's lips curled into a sly smile. "I don't? Then let me prove it to you." He gestured to one of the guards who had been standing by the door, a man who had been following Adekunle's movements for weeks. "Tell her what you saw at the stream," Kehinde commanded, his voice sharp. The guard stepped forward, his face grim as he recounted what he had seen. Aminat, Elder Durojaye's wife, and Adekunle locked in a passionate embrace by the water's edge, their bodies entwined as they succumbed to their desires. The details were enough to make Madame Ronke's stomach churn with jealousy and fury. Kehinde's eyes never left her face as the guard finished his report. You see, Ronke, Kehinde said softly, Adekunle is just like his father. He uses women to climb his way to power, but he'll never stay loyal. You're just another conquest to him. Madame Ronke's hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay composed. Even if that's true, the vote remains the same. I'm ending the slave trade. Kehinde smirked, his eyes glinting with victory. Oh no, Ronke, you won't. I'll make sure of it. You think Adekunle can give you power? I'll give you more land, enough farmland to make you the richest woman in this village. We'll control the exports, not the village. You'll benefit from the profits directly, just like I will. No one else needs to know. Madame Ronke hesitated, her mind spinning with conflict. She had trusted Adekunle, but now doubt gnawed at her. If what Kehinde said was true, then perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps Adekunle was just using her, just like Olamide had used women in the past. The idea of controlling the farmland, of having that kind of power, it was tempting. I'll think about it, Madame Ronke said, her voice tight. Kehinde smiled, knowing he had planted the seeds of doubt. Good. The vote remains, and you'll see things my way. Kehinde wasn't finished. Madame Ronke wasn't the only one who needed to be reminded of loyalty. The next day, Kehinde arranged a private meeting with Elder Durojaye, who had always been a strong supporter of the slave trade. But the elder had grown suspicious recently. His young wife, Aminat, had been subtly pushing him to change his stance. The whispers in the village were that she had been influenced by Adekunle. Kehinde greeted the elder with a solemn nod. Elder, I have something you need to hear. Elder Durojaye frowned. Wetin be this, Kehinde? You dey look too serious. It's about Aminat, Kehinde began carefully. I have reason to believe she's been compromised by Adekunle. The elder stiffened. What you dey talk about? I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't have proof, Kehinde continued. One of my men saw her by the stream. She was with Adekunle, and it wasn't just a conversation. They were involved. Durojaye's face darkened, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. You dey tell me say my wife dey cheat on me with that fool? Kehinde nodded slowly. I didn't want to believe it myself, but the evidence is clear. Adekunle has been manipulating her, trying to get her to sway your vote in the Congress. The elder's fists clenched at his sides, but then he hesitated, doubt creeping into his mind. Aminat had denied any involvement with Adekunle when he had confronted her earlier. She had been adamant that nothing had happened, and Durojaye had wanted to believe her. But now, hearing this from Kehinde, she say na lie, Durojaye muttered, though his voice was uncertain. Kehinde leaned in, his voice lowering conspiratorially. She's saying what she thinks you want to hear, Elder. But I'm telling you, Adekunle is dangerous. He's using her, just like he's using other women. You know how these things go. If you trust her to lead you, you'll end up making a grave mistake. Durojaye was silent for a moment, his face a storm of emotions, anger, suspicion, hurt. So wetin you suggest? Kehinde's smile returned, cold and calculating. Stay loyal to me. Keep your vote as it is, and once this is all over, you'll have more than enough wealth to secure your legacy. I'll give you control over the farm exports, land that will be yours to manage. You don't need to listen to Aminat on this. She's being manipulated. The elder nodded slowly, still conflicted, but the promise of wealth and control over the farm exports was enough to cloud his judgment. I'll think about it. Kehinde knew that with Durojaye's loyalty secured and Madame Ronke's doubt sown, the next Congress vote would not go in Adekunle's favor. The game was far from over, and Kehinde intended to win. The day of the Congress vote arrived with an air of anticipation and tension that seemed to hang over the entire village. Adekunle had spent weeks preparing, building alliances, and carefully securing promises from key figures. He had felt confident, perhaps too confident, that the vote would go in his favor and finally end the slave trade. As the Congress convened, Adekunle sat with his allies, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Madame Ronke and Elder Durojaye, both of whom had assured him privately that they would support him. But something in their expressions was off. Madame Ronke's eyes were cold, distant, while Elder Durojaye shifted uncomfortably in his seat, refusing to meet Adekunle's gaze. The vote began, each Congress member standing and announcing their decision. One by one, the members cast their votes, many in favor of continuing the trade, as expected. But Adekunle's heart sank when Madame Ronke stood, her voice steady as she cast her vote in support of the slave trade. "I support the continuation of the trade," she said, her words like a knife twisting in Adekunle's chest. Next came Elder Durojaye, who, after a moment of hesitation, echoed her decision. "I vote to maintain the slave trade." Adekunle couldn't believe what he was hearing. The votes that should have been on his side, the very people he had trusted, had turned against him. He felt a surge of anger and confusion, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. By the time the final vote was cast, it was clear Kehinde had won. The Congress had voted to continue the slave trade, and Adekunle's plans had been crushed. As the session ended and the Congress members began to leave, Adekunle's thoughts were a whirlwind of betrayal and frustration. How could Madame Ronke, after everything, betray him like this? How had Kehinde managed to sway them? Later that evening, as Adekunle was still reeling from the loss, he received an unexpected visit. Madame Ronke appeared at his door, her face a mask of fury. "Adekunle," she spat, her voice sharp and venomous. "I came to tell you never to come near me again." Adekunle was stunned, stepping back as she advanced toward him. "Ronke, wait! Don't say another word," Madame Ronke interrupted, her eyes blazing with anger. You're just like your father Olamide. You think you can use women, charm them, make them believe you care, only to discard them when it suits you." Adekunle's heart dropped. "Ronke, that's not true. I never meant to." She cut him off again, her voice shaking with both rage and hurt. "You don't care about me. You only care about yourself, about your ambitions. Kehinde was right. You're just using me, the same way you used Aminat. I know what happened at the stream, Adekunle. You're no different from the man who fathered you." Adekunle opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain that what had happened with Aminat was never meant to harm her, but he could see in Madame Ronke's eyes that it was too late. Kehinde's poison had already sunk deep into her heart. "From now on," Madame Ronke continued, her voice low and dangerous, "if you come near me again, I'll have you killed. Don't think I won't." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving Adekunle standing in the doorway, his chest tight with a mixture of frustration and heartbreak. He knew without a doubt that this betrayal had Kehinde's fingerprints all over it. The loss of the vote was a devastating blow, but the personal betrayal cut even deeper. Kehinde had not just won in the Congress. He had won in turning the people closest to Adekunle against him. Meanwhile, in his private quarters, Kehinde sat, a smug smile playing on his lips as he listened to his spies report back to him. The plan had worked perfectly. Madame Ronke's fury was exactly what he had hoped for, and Elder Durojaye's doubt had been exploited to its fullest extent. "You see," Kehinde said, leaning back in his chair. "Adekunle thinks he can win by charming women and making promises, but he's too much like his father. And now his own ambitions will destroy him." Elder Sola, who had been present during the vote, nodded approvingly. "Adekunle, no go recover from this easily. The votes were clear, the slave trade continues, and your grip on the Congress is stronger than ever." Kehinde's grin widened. "Adekunle underestimated me, and now he's paying the price. But this is just the beginning. We're going to ensure that every vote, every decision, goes our way from now on." He leaned forward, his voice lowering as he spoke to his closest advisors. Start working on the next phase. We need to tighten control over the land, especially the farms. If we control the resources, we control everything. Across the village, Aminat sat in her room, staring out the window into the darkness. The news of the vote had reached her, and her heart ached with guilt. She had been the one to push her husband, Elder Durojaye, to vote against the slave trade. She had thought she could sway him, but Kehinde's influence had proven stronger. Aminat felt torn between the loyalty she had for her husband and the growing feelings she had developed for Adekunle after their passionate encounter at the stream. Now, everything seemed to be falling apart. Her husband had returned from the Congress with suspicion in his eyes, though he hadn't said anything yet. How did things go so wrong? She whispered to herself, her hands trembling as she remembered the look in Adekunle's eyes when they had been together. She had believed in him, in his vision for the future. But now, doubt gnawed at her heart. Had she been wrong to trust him? As the night deepened, Adekunle stood alone, the weight of his defeat pressing heavily on his shoulders. The betrayal from Madame Ronke stung deeply, but more than that, the loss of the vote had shaken his confidence. But as he stared into the darkened village, he knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. Kehinde had won this battle, but the war was not yet decided. I underestimated him, Adekunle muttered to himself, clenching his fists, but I won't make that mistake again. He would have to rebuild both his alliances and his strategy. And this time, he wouldn't just rely on charm and persuasion. He would need to think like Kehinde, to anticipate his brother's moves, and to find a way to turn the tide in his favor. Because in the end, Adekunle knew one truth that Kehinde could never understand. The people wanted change, and he would be the one to lead them, no matter how many obstacles stood in his way. The Congress vote had ended in a devastating defeat. As the villagers dispersed and the weight of betrayal settled on his shoulders, Adekunle felt the sting of failure more deeply than ever before. He had been confident, too confident, that the vote would end the slave trade, that his alliances with Madame Ronke and Elder Durojaye would ensure his victory. But now, those alliances were shattered. As night fell, Adekunle walked through the quiet village streets, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about Madame Ronke's bitter words, her betrayal, and how deeply Kehinde had manipulated her. He had underestimated his half-brother's cunning, and now the price was clear. When he finally arrived at the meeting place, hidden deep within the forest, his closest allies awaited him. Tunde, the quiet but deadly hunter, sat sharpening his blade, his face as unreadable as ever. Beside him stood Folak, the fierce widow who had become Adekunle's most trusted confidant and lover. Her expression was one of quiet fury. She had always been a warrior, and the sting of defeat only hardened her resolve. Morayo, Adekunle's half-sister and his most calming influence, watched him with concern, her brow furrowed as he approached. The silence that hung over them was heavy with unspoken tension. Adekunle took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice tight with frustration. "We lost today," he said, his tone bitter. "Kehinde was ahead of us at every turn. Madame Ronke and Elder Durojaye, they betrayed us." Folake's eyes blazed with anger. "That snake, Kehinde," she spat, her fists clenched at her sides. "I should have seen it coming. I knew Ronke was ambitious, but I didn't think she'd fall for Kehinde's lies so easily." Tunde remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the blade in his hands, but Adekunle could see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles tensed. Tunde was not a man of many words, but his loyalty was unwavering. He would fight for Adekunle without question. Morayo, ever the calming force, stepped forward and placed a hand on Adekunle's shoulder. "This isn't the end, Adekunle," she said softly. "We've faced setbacks before, and we've always found a way to recover. We just need to regroup and plan carefully.